I may speak and write like a pretentious scumbag now, but it wasn't always like this. I used to type like this. To express laughter on the internet, I'd send a message that would look something like this. I was Jedge, and screw it, I loved that little phase of mine. Online persona aside, 2009 to 2012 was when I started learning. It's when I started discovering myself, finding out what my interests were, what I was good at, what I wasn't. It's when I started to understand what it was to love, be it friends, family, or partners. It's when I started to get a grasp on the depth and complexity of human emotions. Basically, I was going through puberty at that time. And like me, the internet and internet culture, SMS culture, pop culture as a whole was going through an awkward growth spurt as well, at least here in the Philippines. That era was unique. Unique in the sense that I don't think it's going through that anymore, and I don't think it ever will. Sure, we don't know what kind of advancements can change and shape the internet and social norms. AI, for example, is a relatively new thing and it completely shifted our approach to everyday life, but what I'm talking about is the baseline, the fundamentals. During those years I mentioned, social media and content sharing platforms were still relatively new. We as a society back then were in a mad scramble to identify what were norms, what weren't, what can and cannot be said and done on the internet, and where to do them. That isn't the case anymore. Nowadays, we have sites and apps that the internet gods have dubbed as our de facto go-tos for content consumption and social interaction. We have pre-established norms and internet etiquette, and all in all, that's a net positive. No shade to Gen Alpha. But what I'm getting at is completely different. It's that going through that phase of mine in that specific era was fun. No, not just it was fun. It's that watching and experiencing this huge thing awkwardly grow alongside me, who was also going through his awkward phase, gave me and a lot of us a type of joy that could never be replicated. It was one of a kind. What I'm getting at is that the Jejemon era mattered, and I'm tired of pretending that it didn't. The term Jejemon has pretty vague origins. No one knows exactly who coined it, no one knows precisely where and when it started creeping into the vernacular or the zeitgeist, but the moment someone hears it, they know exactly what it connotes. Typing or texting in this hard-to-understand, randomly capitalized mess of words, emojis, and punctuation marks. Clothing that looks like an ungodly amalgam of late 80s to 90s fashion trends and more modern for the time sensibilities. Ballers, varsity jackets, those polka-dotted dresses, large frame shades, super sneakers and snapbacks, Domokun backpacks, music that varies from hardcore gangsta rap to lovelorn ballads or sometimes a mishmash of both. And we can't forget the other things, tangible and intangible, that came along with it. 6120 classics and Galaxy Ys, Christmas parties that would have at least a few members of the class pretending to be Jabberwockies, Friendster pages that would have all the wonderful and colorful fonts and plugins that you could think of, those cute top-view millennial selfies, and I think most especially those identifiers, those call signs that people would know you by whenever you'd send a group message to the 6 to 8 people in your GM list, or that you would name yourself in your Friendster or Facebook profile. One can say the Jejemon was born strictly out of necessity, given that SMS messages had to be shortened to 160 characters back in the day, so we had to find clever and innovative ways to shorten our messages. More on that later. But what the hell do you call this then? Or this? This doesn't look like a product of necessity at all. Even if we assume that the Jeje era started out of necessity, one cannot deny that it outlived its initial purpose and morphed into something greater. Something that touched on and informed not just our texting language, but every facet of our everyday lives back in the day. I think that Jejemon is something greater. I think it was a subculture all on its own. And more importantly, it was a movement. It was this monolith that represented our cultural pivot, that signified that times were changing and that we were well and truly into the Wi-Fi or SMS boom and the social networking era. More importantly, it was this touchstone that reflected our very Filipino, very individualistic need to be identified, to be unique, to express the way we want to express, to be different. And it mattered, not just incidentally, not just because the movement just so happened to brew up alongside this massive event that we call the internet or SMS boom. Let me put you guys on wax. I think the Jejemon era mattered for these reasons. Culture and identity. Just those two. Let's get into them. Number 1. Culture. This sounds all too familiar, doesn't it? Let's look at things from a different perspective though. Let's talk about cultural amalgamation. This is a phenomenon that occurs when two cultures mix together to create a new one. And though this concept was used mainly to explain what the hell was happening in 19th century US when people were starting to realize that it's an actual melting pot, I think it finds application in the modern context as well. At its core, cultural amalgamation begins when a group of individuals from one culture encounters another group from a different culture. Of course, the people who coined this term envisioned something completely different from what was about to happen post-internet boom. I'm pretty sure they imagined these cultural interactions to be IRL ones, not long-distance ones. Like say engaging in trade, diplomacy, or colonialization, for example. But one can't deny that the same ends were met. Whether or not it was done through the internet, what matters is that one culture comes to appreciate the cultural touchstones of another, and they merge it with theirs. That's how amalgamation ends. Now, one can argue that this might be a form of hybridization or assimilation, but I posit that this isn't true. See, hybridization or assimilation connotes that one subservient culture, usually part of a minority group, is absorbed into a larger, more dominant culture, or at least changes itself to make way for the cultural norms of the more dominant culture. In amalgamation, though, there is no dominant culture. Amalgamation is achieved when there is an appreciation for what the other culture brings and a subsequent adaptation or iteration of the things that they bring. I think this is more in line with how we interacted with the cultural tidal wave that was the internet, that was texting. See, there wasn't a single culture that we amalgamated with. It was everything, everywhere, all at once. See what I did there? Moreover, core Filipino cultural traits and touchstones still remained as they were. It's just that we began taking things from other cultures. We didn't suddenly become a hyper-liberalized country. We didn't phase out OPM to make way for international acts, contrary to what some journalists would have you believe. We didn't get rid of manopos and the balots and the tajos. At the risk of sounding stereotypical, we remained Filipinos. We remained unique. It's just that we were learning and adding things to our culture that made us more globalized. And whether you view it as a good thing or a bad thing, you can't deny that the way we translated and took in all of these new things being presented to us shows character. It shows creativity. In hindsight, it shows how different and wacky we can get. What am I getting at? It's that the Jejemon model, whether you attach it with a negative or positive connotation, is emblematic of how we appreciate and creatively incorporate into our vernacular, into our zeitgeist, into our day-to-day lives, foreign cultural contributions. I don't think its significance to culture stops there though. See, we have this thing called Filipino resilience, usually represented by the Bayanihan concept. I don't want to get into a discussion about whether or not that's a good thing, that's a story for another time, but resilience isn't just limited to Bayanihan. Functionally, it's one's ability to adapt to massive changes and massive encumbrances. The introduction of SMS and the internet to one's daily routine was a massive change. The 160 character limit and the inability to visibly express emotions through text was an obstacle. And what does Filipino resilience do to adapt to this change and overcome these hurdles? Exactly, the jumbled mess of words that you see now. But again, given that a way to overcome that limit was a matter of necessity, that means that 1, you can do it without being Jejemon, and 2, every other country likely did the same thing, right? Correct. But I think it's important to discuss these key points. As to the first one, yes, you were free to choose not to be Jejemon, and more power to those who chose not to succumb to these Jej tendencies, but this isn't about who is or who isn't. This video is more about celebrating those who were. But let's discuss this for a bit. I think there's something very interesting about this subject. I think it's important to note that being Jej was a conscious choice, meaning that it was equal, or at least equally accessible. You were free to opt in and opt out of it, meaning that it didn't matter which class you came from, what your age was, how well read or well educated you were, or what your standing was in life, or what your dialect was. Jejemania affected all of us equally. Of course, on the subject of likelihoods, you were more likely to opt into being Jej if you were in an environment and in social circles that proliferated it. But still, those social circles, that environment, didn't choose or discriminate either. You could be in a group of people in largely the same class as you, and a few of you would be Jej. You could interact with another circle full of people above your perceived bracket and still find a Jejemon there. What I'm getting at here is that Jejemania was the great equalizer for a time. And I find that notion comforting. I find this idea that there was something that pervasive, that essential to our everyday lives, that didn't care about social inequities or economic disparities, that didn't care about age or mental aptitude. comforting. All of it was your choice, and it was equal. Sure, there were a few entities and persons of note who pushed against it, but we'll get to that subject in a bit. As to the second point of discussion, yes, every other country likely did the same thing. However, not to the degree that we did, not to the point that it birthed an actual variation of the language in and of itself, not to the point that it went beyond the bounds of necessity to such a degree that it outgrew its initial purpose and all of the convenience that used to come along with it, not to the point that it broke free of its initial box of just being a texting language and became a character trait all on its own, a character trait that, mind you, informed everything from your clothing choice to your music preference to even your own identity. More on that in a bit. This is what I mean by the movement outgrowing the necessity. It set aside the very reason it had for existing and just became its own thing organically. But on the subject of language, let's get into that. Jejemon, the form of writing at least, received a lot of pushback. Our very own Department of Education, oddly enough, issued a public service announcement against the quote-unquote trend, mechanizing teachers to move against it with the rationale that it was detrimental to the language. This told me two things. One, even as a kid, it showed me what this government's actual priorities were. It says a lot when even a child was aware of how short-sighted and needless it all was, but that's a story for another time. And number two, that there's a specific section of people back in the day that were staunch in defending the purity of the language, that wanted to protect the language from deterioration. Let's engage that notion. This idea that Jejemon was somehow harmful to the Filipino language. The famous Lord de Vera took to writing a piece way back when in defense of Jeja culture, stating that actively bashing Jejemons on social media does not represent a quantum leap in intellectual development, and that people who barely have a grasp on any language have no business telling other people how to use it. While I loved his talking points for their comedic value, I think it's time that we discuss them further. We pride ourselves in how well constructed, how poetic, how romantic our languages. There's a lot of truth to that. To that end, I can see why people would act against the perceived misuse of the language. But Filipino, Tagalog, in its purest form isn't perfect. It doesn't cover every possible use case, and I'm pretty sure that the people of the olden days never accounted for the influx of new terminologies that would come our way by the time telco companies flicked the on switch on the internet. But that's where another point of pride when it comes to the Filipino language comes in. The fact that it's dynamic and ever evolving. I see the Filipino language, honestly, any language, as a manifestation of culture itself. Any linguist would tell you that languages evolve at certain points in time because they interact and intermingle with other languages. Sound familiar? This is doubly true in our case because ours is an agglutinative language, or one whose words are often formed by combining smaller, meaningful units. I'm not a language expert, but what this tells us is that the language is very fluid. Ours is a very special case of a language's fluidity, its dynamism, allowing the adaptation of foreign languages to happen with relative ease. The most clear example of everything I've been talking about thus far is how the English language was incorporated in our lexicon. We embraced it fully by way of combining English root words with our tenses, suffixes, and prefixes. We even made our own iterations of the English language called Taglish and its less accepted younger brother, Konyo Taglish, so what am I getting at? It's that, from a linguistic perspective, the way that we birthed the Jejemon language, or at least the form of writing, isn't any much different from how we develop our adaptations of any other foreign language, except this time it's the internet and pop culture that we were adapting. When the language of the internet back then, emoticons, acronyms, punctuation marks, buzzwords, character limits, and all, was introduced to us, we adapted. We assimilated it all by building an iteration of it that fits our vernacular, the Jejemon. And if that's not emblematic of how dynamic and ever-evolving our language is, I don't know what is. Let's talk identity. You might be asking yourself right about now. Okay, you talked about large-scale things, culture, language, the internet, but when do you talk about me? My experiences, or when do you talk about your experiences then relate them to mine at least? Well, that's the thing. I've been talking about us since the beginning, and this is not an attempt at gaslighting you, I swear. Like it or not, and for better or worse, whether you assimilate or act in the contrary, you are a reflection of your culture. your environment, your upbringing, your language. Almost everything you do, almost everything you are, is informed by what's happened and what is happening around you. We were molded and shaped by this movement, is what I'm saying. I've been talking about us on an individual level since the start, but okay, let's go deeper. You remember usernames, right? Gamer tags. Mine used to be PokeZeke. Then it became XKiller25 as I was entering my edgy rebelde phase. Then I settled with Tier 2 or any variation of Dwight. Why am I talking about this? It's because whether in-game or outside of it, our generation had this very individualistic need to set ourselves apart. And whether it was by design or by complete and total coincidence, we were consequently given those tools and that allowance to self-express. In video games, we had usernames and gamer tags. Outside of games, in SMS or on our prehistoric socials, we had our little call signs. Remember those things I mentioned earlier in the video? Those little identifiers? Those things mattered because they're not just attached to ourselves, our person, but they're a reflection of where we were back then. What we were feeling, what we were informed by. Doesn't matter if you call yourself May Colette's 27 or X Fallen Angel X. Those call signs connote something. The moment you send that GM and people see that username, that call sign, that identifier, even without reading the body of your text, they have a general idea of what kind of person you were and what your current mood was, what type of things you're going through. And it wasn't just confined to those call signs, it was also echoed in those little things. The level of customization we had in our Friendster pages. Those weird 4-picture banner things we used to have at the top of our Facebook accounts that we'd play around with. Our Farmville farms, our Ninja Saga ninjas, and AQ Worlds characters. We were given so many freaking tools to self-express, to tell the world who we were, to give everyone a holistic picture of ourselves. And this worked hand in hand with the Jeje Era. The Jeje Era allowed us to go completely apeshit with the self-expression. When I first started writing for this video, I wanted it to be a celebration of days gone by and a movement now forgotten to time. I wanted it to be a way of shifting the narrative around the Jejemon discussion to make it, less negative and more
positive.
But now I realize that you can do that with just a few words. This, in truth, is a love letter. A love letter to a friend and a support system that we didn't know we had. A piece about how we didn't even know how good we had it. And a pat in the back for everyone who feels like a piece of them is somehow missing. So chin up, Jeje Monster. Dust off that Domo-kun backpack. Play some Dota Oroho. Keep calm and carry on. Bye for now.